Nobody believed the janitor who found them first. He had no authority, no training, just a wire brush and a choice nobody else could make. This is the story of how one floor scrubber burned an entire district alive to save the Hive, and why the Imperium will never admit it happened. I learned the smell of rot before I knew its name. The manufactorum vents of Hive Tertius were never clean, never silent, never kind. They were the bowels of a city that scraped the sky, a network of corroded arteries where the waste of 30 million souls moved in slow, viscous currents toward processing pits older than memory. I was a floor scrubber, one of thousands, a man whose entire existence could be summarized in the daily logi as a 6-digit identifier and a work shift notation. My name was Callow Brint, though nobody called me that. In the vents, I was simply the scrubber on rotation 7, the one who walked the eastern tunnels when the klaxons announced the start of third shift, carrying a Plastec bucket and a wire brush that had outlived 3 previous handlers. The Emperor protects, or so the preachers said during the mandatory dawn sermons piped through the vox grills. Down here, the Emperor's protection manifested as a rebreather mask that barely filtered the air, and a work quota that made sleep a luxury reserved for rest days that came once every 14 cycles. The vents smelled of grease and human effluents, of chemical runoff, and the peculiar tang of overheated metal that had been recycled too many times. That was normal. That was acceptable. The Administratum had long ago determined the acceptable thresholds for atmospheric toxicity in sub-level workers, and we existed just beneath that threshold, breathing air that tasted of copper and decay, but would not kill us outright. I had walked these corridors for 11 years, since my 16th name day, when my mother pressed my enrollment papers into my hand and told me the factorum floors were too dangerous for someone with my weak constitution. The vents were safer, she said, quieter. I would not be crushed by stamping presses or melted by promethium leaks. I would simply scrub and breathe and collect my ration chits and perhaps live long enough to see my 30th year. She had been wrong about the quiet. The vents howled with the sound of rushing liquid, the groan of ancient pipes expanding and contracting, the distant thrum of massive filtration engines that turned filth into something marginally less lethal. But she had been right about the safety, at least until the day the cysts appeared. I noticed them on the 3rd morning of the month, the Administratum designated as Septimus. The shift began as it always did, with the descent down 17 flights of corroded stairs into the access hub where the work crews gathered to receive their assignments. Overseer Menth, a woman whose face had been half replaced by a crude augmetic after a pipe burst had scalded her 20 years prior, read from a data slate without looking at us. Her remaining eye was milky, half-blind, but her voice carried the absolute authority of someone who had survived long enough to become indispensable. She assigned me to the eastern secondary vents, the same route I had walked 1,000 times before. The eastern vents ran parallel to the main sanitation arteries, carrying overflow from the processing districts when the primary channels became clogged. It was tedious work, scraping accumulation from the grates, checking pressure valves, ensuring nothing ruptured catastrophically. I took my bucket, my brush, my glow rod, and descended into the tunnels without a word. The first cyst was growing on the junction where Pipe 7 met the overflow channel. It was small, no larger than my closed fist, a bulbous growth that protruded from the pipe's surface like a tumor. The metal around it had discolored, turning a mottled greenish-brown that reminded me of meat left too long in the heat. I stopped, holding my glow rod close, and stared at it. In 11 years, I had never seen anything grow on the pipes. Corrosion, yes. Rust and mineral buildup, certainly. But not this. Not something that looked almost organic, almost alive. The surface glistened in the weak light, slick with a moisture that dripped slowly onto the grated floor. I reached out, hesitated, then prodded it gently with the end of my brush. The growth yielded under pressure, soft and pliable, and a smell rose from it that made my stomach clench. It was not the usual smell of the vents. It was sweeter, richer, the smell of overripe fruit and spoiled milk, and something else I could not name. I pulled my hand back and made a notation in the small leather-bound logbook all scrubbers were required to carry. Anomalous growth on Pipe 7 junction. Recommend inspection. I moved on, trying to ignore the unease that had settled into my chest. By mid-shift, I had found 6 more. They varied in size, some small as pebbles, others as large as a human head, clustered around pipe joints and valve housings like fungal blooms. The discoloration spread outward from each one, staining the metal in patterns that reminded me of bruises on skin. The smell grew stronger as I moved deeper into the eastern vents, a cloying sweetness that penetrated even my rebreather mask. I documented each one, my handwriting growing shakier as the list lengthened. The tunnels felt different now, oppressive in a way they had never been before. The sound of the pipes seemed louder, more irregular, as though something were moving inside them that should not be there. I told myself it was nothing, that the Mechanicus servitors would identify the problem during their monthly inspection rounds, that this was not my concern beyond making a report. But the unease remained, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. When I returned to the access hub at shift's end, I handed my logbook to Overseer Menk and waited while she read my notations. Her milky eye did not move, but her good one scanned the pages with increasing speed. She closed the logbook and looked at me for the first time in months. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of irritation and something that might have been concern. She told me to report to the eastern vents again the following shift, to monitor the growths and document any changes. She did not tell me what she thought they were. She did not tell me to avoid them. She simply handed back the logbook and dismissed me with a wave of her augmetic hand. I climbed the 17 flights of stairs to the worker habitation blocks, my legs aching, my lungs burning with the effort of breathing recycled air for 12 hours straight. I ate my ration of protein paste and fungal bread in silence, surrounded by other scrubbers who spoke in low voices about quotas and equipment failures and the rumor that the upper hive had increased water rationing again. Nobody mentioned the cysts. Nobody had seen what I had seen. That night, I dreamed of pipes that breathed. The second shift into the eastern vents confirmed my fears. The cysts had grown. The small ones from the previous day were now the size of my head, their surfaces stretched taut and gleaming with that strange moisture. The larger ones had swollen grotesquely, some now as big as a man's torso, pressing against the tunnel walls and forcing me to squeeze past them to reach the deeper sections. The discoloration had spread dramatically, covering entire sections of pipe in that mottled greenish-brown. Worse, some of the cysts had begun to weep. Thick, viscous fluid oozed from splits in their surfaces, dripping onto the floor in slow, steady streams. The smell was overpowering now, so strong that I vomited into my rebreather mask and had to stop to clean it, my hands shaking. I documented everything with frantic precision, filling page after page of my logbook with measurements, locations, descriptions. The pipes were definitely making new sounds now, wet gurgling noises that rose and fell in rhythm, as though something vast were breathing through the entire network. I was not alone in the vents that day. Midway through my shift, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Overseer Menk herself descending into the tunnel, accompanied by a figure I did not recognize. The stranger wore the rust-red robes of the Adeptus Mechanicus, though they were stained and tattered in a way that suggested long service in the Underhive. His face was hidden behind a rebreather far more sophisticated than mine, and his hands were entirely augmetic, fingers ending in delicate manipulator tools. He carried a handheld Auspex, its screen flickering with green light. Menk introduced him as Engineer Torv, assigned to the sanitation district's maintenance cadre. She told me to show him the cysts. I led them through the tunnels, stopping at each growth to let Torva scan it with his Auspex. He said nothing, his body language impossible to read beneath the robes. When we reached the largest cluster, a mass of cysts that had grown together into a single bulging wall of diseased flesh blocking nearly half the tunnel, he finally spoke. His voice was mechanical, filtered through his rebreather into a flat monotone. The readings were consistent with biological contamination, bacterial proliferation on an unprecedented scale, possible fungal interaction, origin unknown. He paused, adjusting settings on his Auspex. Recommendation: immediate quarantine and purge protocols. Mength asked how long a purge would take. Torve tilted his head, his augmetic eyes clicking as they refocused. With current resources and assuming containment holds, approximately 48 hours. If contamination has spread to the primary arteries, significantly longer. He looked at me then, and I saw something in his mechanical gaze that might have been pity. You should not return to this section. The risk of infection is non-trivial. They left me standing in the tunnel, staring at the wall of cysts. I did not return to the eastern vents the next day. Overseer Mength reassigned me to the western channels, safer territory far from the contamination. But the change of location did nothing to ease my mind. I could not stop thinking about those growths, about the way they had swelled and wept, about the smell that had burned itself into my memory. The other scrubbers began to whisper. Rumors spread through the worker habitation blocks like wildfire. Someone said the eastern vents had been sealed. Someone else claimed they had seen Arbites moving into the lower levels, their carapace armor gleaming in the glowrod light. A third voice insisted that entire work crews had been quarantined, locked in their dormitories without explanation. I kept my head down and scrubbed my assigned channels, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of work. The quarantine lasted 3 days before it broke. I was not there when it happened. I learned about it the way everyone in the Underhive learns about disaster, through fragmented reports and panicked rumors that spread faster than any official communication. A pipe had burst in the eastern secondary vents, not a normal rupture, not the kind that spilled water or waste or chemical runoff. This was something else. The reports were confused, contradictory, but the core facts emerged quickly enough. When the pipe burst, it had released a cloud of spores into the air, a thick, greenish mist that spread through the tunnels with unnatural speed. The workers who had been sealing the contaminated section were caught in the initial release. Within hours, they began to change. The symptoms started with fever and nausea, progressing rapidly to open sores and suppurating wounds. Their skin turned the same mottled greenish brown as the cysts on the pipes. They vomited fluids that reeked of decay. Some collapsed and did not rise again. Others kept moving, shambling through the tunnels with their bodies visibly rotting, spreading the infection to anyone they encountered. The Arbites moved in with flamers and sealed the eastern vents completely, but the spores had already spread beyond the initial breach. The ventilation systems that circulated air through the lower manufactorum districts carried the contamination to new areas, new pipes, new workers. Cysts began appearing in the western channels, then in the northern processing yards, then in the habitation blocks themselves. The Administratum issued a quarantine order for the entire sub-level, sealing the main access points and posting armed guards at every stairwell. No one was permitted to ascend to the upper hive. No one was permitted to leave their assigned districts. The official explanation, broadcast through crackling Vox speakers, spoke of a localized sanitation failure and assured us that Mechanicus technicians were working to resolve the issue. They did not mention the spores. They did not mention the workers who had turned into walking corpses. They did not mention the word plague. I saw my first infected on the 5th day of the quarantine. His name had been Julm, a scrubber who worked the northern channels. I had shared meals with him in the communal feeding hall, had listened to him complain about his failing joints and the overseer who docked his ration chits for minor infractions. Now he stumbled through the corridor outside my dormitory, his body bent and twisted by growths that erupted from his flesh like the cysts on the pipes. His skin had split in dozens of places, revealing suppurating tissue beneath. The smell that came from him was the same sweet rot I had first encountered in the eastern vents, magnified 1,000 times. He did not seem to see me. His eyes were clouded, filmed over with a milky substance. He walked with a lurching gait, one arm hanging useless at his side, the other reaching out as though grasping for something only he could perceive. I pressed myself against the wall and held my breath as he passed, praying he would not notice me. He did not. He continued down the corridor, leaving a trail of viscous fluid behind him, and disappeared into the shadows. The Arbites' barriers fell on the 7th day. I was not there to witness it, but the sound carried through the entire sub-level. A massive detonation, followed by the staccato crack of lasgun fire, followed by screaming. The infection had spread to the Arbeits checkpoint at the primary access stairwell, overwhelming the guards despite their armor and weapons. Infected workers swarmed the barricades, driven by something that might have been hunger or might have been simple, mindless compulsion. The Arbeits held for nearly an hour before falling back, sealing emergency bulkheads behind them and abandoning the lower districts entirely. We were alone now, thousands of workers trapped in a labyrinth of corridors and tunnels with an infection that turned flesh into rotting mulch and showed no signs of stopping. The Vox speakers went silent. The glow rods began to fail as power distribution faltered. In the darkness, the sounds of the infected grew louder. That was when I remembered the purifiers. The waste purifiers were ancient mechanisms installed during the Hive's construction millennia ago, massive furnace engines designed to incinerate biological waste when the standard filtration systems became overwhelmed. They occupied a sub-basement beneath the eastern vents, a cavernous space I had visited exactly once during my training when Overseer Menth had led the new scrubbers on a tour of the critical infrastructure. She had explained, in her flat, emotionless voice, that the purifiers were relics of a more brutal age, when the Hive's population had been smaller and the Mechanicus less concerned with efficiency than with absolute sterilization. The purifiers could generate temperatures high enough to reduce organic matter to ash in seconds. They had not been activated in over 3 centuries, deemed too destructive, too wasteful of resources. But the mechanisms remained, maintained by servitors who performed their rituals without understanding, waiting for an activation command that might never come. I had no authority to access the purifiers. I had no training in their operation. I was a floor scrubber, a man whose entire technical education consisted of learning which pipes could be safely touched and which valves should never be turned. But I also knew that the infection was spreading, that the barriers had fallen, that the Administratum had abandoned us to die in the darkness. I knew that if the spores reached the upper hive, if they spread through the ventilation systems into the factorums and hab towers and administrative districts, millions would die. The entire hive might fall, and I knew, with a certainty that felt like cold iron in my chest, that no one was coming to save us. I left my dormitory before dawn on the 8th day. The corridors were nightmare landscapes now. The cysts had spread to the walls themselves, growing in thick clusters that pulsed with a rhythm that mimicked breathing. The floor was slick with the fluids that wept from their surfaces, forcing me to move carefully to avoid slipping. Infected workers wandered in small groups, their bodies so thoroughly corrupted that I could no longer recognize individual faces. Some had collapsed where they stood, their corpses serving as substrate for new growths that sprouted from their rotting flesh. The air was thick with spores, visible as a faint greenish haze in the few remaining glow rods. I wrapped a strip of cloth around my face, knowing it would do nothing against true contamination but needing the psychological comfort of a barrier. I carried my glow rod in one hand and my logbook in the other, clinging to these familiar tools as though they could protect me from what I was about to attempt. The path to the purifier sub-basement led through the eastern vents. I knew this. I had known this since the memory surfaced. There was no other route, no alternative access. The eastern vents, where the infection had begun, where the cysts grew thickest, where the air itself seemed to writhe with living corruption. I stood at the entrance for a long moment, staring into the darkness, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I thought of Julm, shambling through the corridors with his body split open. I thought of the workers who had been caught in the initial spore release, who had rotted alive in a matter of hours. I thought of my mother, who lived somewhere in the mid-hive, who might still be safe if I could stop this before it climbed higher. I took a breath that tasted of sweet decay and stepped into the tunnel. The eastern vents had become something alien. The cysts covered every surface now, forming a continuous carpet of diseased flesh that squelched beneath my boots. The pipes were no longer visible, buried beneath layers of growth. The tunnel had narrowed as the biomass expanded, forcing me to walk hunched over in places, my shoulders brushing against surfaces that felt warm and slightly yielding. The smell was indescribable, a concentrated essence of rot so powerful that it felt physical, like a weight pressing against my face. My eyes watered, my stomach heaved. I forced myself forward, step by step, following the route from memory. The sounds were worse than the smell. The wet breathing rhythm had intensified, no longer an occasional gurgle but a constant rasping wheeze that filled the tunnel. And beneath it, I heard other sounds, whispers, laughter, voices that spoke in languages I did not know. That might not have been languages at all, but simply the random firing of a diseased mind interpreting noise as meaning. I found the first body halfway to the sub-basement. It was one of the Arbites who had been guarding the eastern vent seals. His carapace armor was scorched and cracked, as though he had stood against a flamer. But that had not killed him. The cysts had grown through the cracks, burrowing into his flesh, transforming him into a hybrid of man and corruption. His face was still recognizable, frozen in an expression of absolute horror. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. I stepped around him carefully, trying not to think about what his last moments must have been like, trying not to imagine the feeling of foreign growth pushing through skin and muscle and bone. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and I stopped. Before me was a scene from the deepest pits of hell. The chamber had once been a junction hub, where multiple pipe systems converged before descending to the purifiers. Now it was a cathedral of decay. The cysts had merged into massive structures, towering columns of diseased biomass that rose from floor to ceiling. They pulsed with a bioluminescent glow, sickly green light that illuminated the space in shifting patterns. The floor was no longer visible, replaced by a thick carpet of something that moved slightly when I watched it, as though breathing, and scattered throughout the chamber were bodies. Dozens of them. Workers, Arbites, even what looked like a Mechanicus servitor, all of them consumed by the growth. All of them transformed into living architecture for this impossible garden of rot. I saw movement in the shadows. They emerged slowly, figures that had once been human but were now something else entirely. Their bodies were so thoroughly corrupted that calling them infected seemed inadequate. They were walking ecosystems, hosts for 1,000 different strains of decay. Fungal blooms sprouted from their shoulders. Their skin had split to reveal layers of new growth beneath. Their eyes were gone, replaced by clusters of smaller growths that might have served some analogous function. They moved with purpose, not the shambling gait of the newly infected, but with a terrible coordination that suggested intelligence. They were tending the cysts, I realized with dawning horror, touching them gently, adjusting their positions, nurturing them like gardeners cultivating crops. This was not random infection. This was cultivation. This was purpose. One of them noticed me. It turned its eyeless head in my direction, the growths that replaced its eyes flexing and contracting. It made a sound, a wet clicking that might have been communication. The others stopped their work and turned as well. I counted 7 of them, standing among the columns of diseased flesh, regarding me with what felt like curiosity. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, human and post-human, separated by a transformation I could barely comprehend. Then one of them took a step toward me, extending an arm that ended not in a hand but in a cluster of writhing tendrils. I ran. I crashed through the chamber, my boots splashing through the living carpet, my shoulders colliding with columns that yielded like flesh. Behind me, I heard them following, their footsteps making wet slapping sounds against the biomass. They did not run. They did not need to. They knew these tunnels better than I did now, knew every shortcut and passage. But I had one advantage. I remembered the route to the purifier sub-basement. I had walked it once, 11 years ago, following Overseer Menkthan, memorizing every turn because that was what I did. That was who I was. A man who recorded details in leather-bound logbooks and remembered pipe junction numbers long after they ceased to matter. The access shaft appeared on my left, exactly where memory said it should be. I dove through the opening and down the maintenance ladder, my hands slipping on rungs that were slick with moisture. The shaft descended into darkness, the glow rod's light barely penetrating the gloom. I could hear them above me, their clicking communication echoing down the shaft. One of them leaned over the edge, looking down at me with its eyeless face. It did not follow. It simply watched as I descended, as though confident that I would fail in whatever I was attempting. The thought filled me with rage, a hot anger that cut through the fear and exhaustion. I would not fail. I would not let this infection climb into the upper hive. I would burn it all away, even if it meant burning myself with it. The shaft ended at a sealed hatch. I recognized it immediately. Heavy plasteel, marked with the cog and skull symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus, surrounded by warning sigils in High Gothic that proclaimed the area beyond restricted to authorized tech priests and servitors. During my training, Overseer Mength had opened this hatch with a keycard that hung from her belt. I had no keycard. I had nothing but a glow rod and a wire brush and a desperate need to reach what lay beyond. I examined the hatch carefully, looking for any weakness, any flaw in its construction. The seal was intact. The locking mechanism pristine despite centuries of neglect. I could not force it. I could not break it. But as I ran my hands over the surface, feeling for seams or access points, my fingers found something unexpected. A small panel, barely visible in the dim light, set into the frame beside the hatch. A manual override, installed during the age when human hands still operated these systems before servitors and machine spirits took over all maintenance. I pressed the panel, and it clicked open, revealing a simple lever. I pulled the lever and the hatch unsealed with a hiss of pressurized air. Beyond was the purifier chamber. It was vast, far larger than I remembered, a cavern carved from the bedrock beneath the hive. The purifiers themselves dominated the space, three massive cylindrical structures that rose from floor to ceiling like pillars supporting the weight of the world above. They were ancient, their surfaces covered in patina and corrosion, but the fundamental architecture remained sound. Pipes fed into them from above, carrying waste from the entire sub-level network. Exhaust vents opened in the ceiling, presumably leading to atmospheric processors that would filter the smoke before releasing it into the hive's air circulation. And surrounding each purifier was a network of smaller mechanisms, pumps and valves and pressure regulators, all maintained by servitors who stood motionless in alcoves along the walls. The servitors noticed me immediately. They were old models, their bodies more machine than flesh, their faces blank metal masks. They did not speak. They did not move to stop me. They simply observed, their optical sensors tracking my movement across the chamber. I walked slowly toward the nearest purifier, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. Up close, the machine was even more impressive. The surface was inscribed with prayers in High Gothic, liturgies to the Omnissiah asking for blessing and proper function. A control console jutted from the base, its surface covered in switches and dials and gauges whose purposes I could only guess at. And beside the console, protected by a glass case marked with warning symbols, was a large red lever. The primary activation control, I realized, the switch that would wake these sleeping giants and turn the sublevel into an inferno. But I hesitated. Pulling that lever would not be a simple matter of destruction. The purifiers were designed to incinerate the waste that flowed through the pipes, not to sterilize an entire district. If I activated them without proper preparation, without adjusting flow rates and pressure settings, the result would be catastrophic. The pipes would rupture, the heat would spread uncontrollably, the entire substructure would collapse, bringing down habitation blocks and work areas and everything else. And everyone still alive down here, everyone who had not yet been infected, would die screaming in the flames. The Administratum report that Overseer Mength had shown us during training had listed the purifier capacity at 300,000 liters of biological waste per hour. A hive district held far more than that. The calculations were simple and terrible. To burn out the infection completely, to ensure no spore survived to spread upward, I would need to flood the purifiers with every pipe in the network simultaneously, overwhelming them until the heat reached critical mass and consumed everything. I would need to sacrifice the entire district. 30,000 workers called the sub-level home. Families, children, people who had committed no crime other than being born in the wrong section of the hive, who had worked their entire lives in service to the Emperor and the Imperium. I thought of Julm, shambling through corridors with his body rotting, I thought of the workers I had seen transformed into gardeners for that impossible cathedral of decay. I thought of the Arbites who had held the barricades until they were overwhelmed. I thought of Overseer Menth, who had tried to contain this before it spread, who might still be somewhere in the darkness. I thought of my mother in the mid-hive, of the millions above who would die if the infection climbed higher. The Emperor protects. That was the phrase they taught us in the mandatory sermons. The Emperor protects. He watches over his servants. He guides the righteous. He stands between humanity and the darkness. But the Emperor was a galaxy away, locked in his golden throne. And we were here, in the bowels of a hive that had never known his direct touch, and the protection we received was the protection we made for ourselves. I had seen the infected, I had seen what this plague could do, and I knew, with a certainty that felt like ice in my veins, that if I did not act, if I did not pull that lever and burn it all away, the entire hive would fall. But first, I needed to understand the machine. I approached the nearest servitor and spoke carefully, using the formal phrases I had heard tech priests employ when addressing machine spirits. I am Callow Brint, authorized maintenance personnel. I require instruction in purifier operation protocols. The servitor did not respond. Its optical sensors continued to track me, but its body remained motionless. I tried again, varying my phrasing, adding invocations to the Omnissiah. Nothing. The servitors were locked into their maintenance routines, unable or unwilling to deviate. I would have to figure this out myself. I returned to the control console and began examining it systematically. The switches were labeled in High Gothic, though the language was archaic and some of the terms unfamiliar. I recognized enough to build a basic understanding. Primary ignition, secondary flow regulation, pressure equalization, emergency shutdown. Each purifier had its own console, its own set of controls. To activate all three simultaneously, I would need to sequence the ignition properly, ensuring the machine spirits awoke in harmony rather than conflict. I opened my logbook and began taking notes, drawing diagrams, recording every detail I could observe. This was what I knew how to do. This was my skill, honed over 11 years of scrubbing floors and checking valves. I recorded things. I remembered patterns. I solved small mechanical problems through patient observation. This was not a small mechanical problem. Hours passed as I worked, cross-referencing the controls on each console, trying to build a complete picture of how the purifiers functioned. The servitors watched, but did not interfere. Occasionally I heard sounds from the access shaft, the wet slapping of footsteps, the clicking communication of the infected. They had found the hatch. They were descending. But they moved slowly, as though time meant nothing to them, as though they knew I was trapped and saw no need to hurry. I forced myself to focus on the console, on the switches and dials, on the problem before me. Panic would not help. Fear would not help. Only knowledge, only understanding, only the careful application of what little skill I possessed. I found the solution in the prayer inscriptions. The High Gothic liturgies were not merely decorative. They were operational instructions, encoded in religious language to ensure only the faithful could interpret them. I read them carefully, sounding out the words, comparing them to the control labels. The pattern emerged slowly. The purifiers were designed to be activated in a specific sequence, each one building on the heat generated by the previous. First, the Western purifier, using emergency flow protocols to flood it with material. Then the Northern, drawing from the overflow. Finally, the Eastern, largest of the three, fed by both primary and secondary pipe networks. The sequence would create a cascade effect, each purifier driving the heat higher until the entire chamber reached critical temperature. At that point, the exhaust vents would seal automatically to contain the inferno, and everything connected to the pipe network would burn, including every tunnel, every corridor, every habitation block in the sub-level. I checked my calculations 3 times, looking for an error, looking for some way to limit the destruction. There was none. The purifiers were all or nothing mechanisms. Either I activated them fully, burning everything, or I did nothing and let the infection spread. There was no middle ground, no partial solution, no way to save even a fraction of the people trapped down here. I thought about warning them, about using the Vox system to announce what I was about to do, to give them time to make peace or flee or pray. But the Vox speakers were dead, and even if they worked, what would I say? That a floor scrubber had decided to murder 30,000 people to save 30 million? That I had appointed myself judge and executioner without authority or sanction? That their deaths were necessary and they should accept it with grace? I could not warn them. I could only act. I began the sequence. The Western Purifier console was the simplest, with fewer controls than the others. I set the primary ignition switch to active position and watched as ancient mechanisms stirred to life. Deep within the machine, I heard the sound of promethium igniters firing, the whoosh of fuel meeting flame. The prayer inscriptions along the purifier's surface began to glow faintly, heated from within. I adjusted the flow regulation to maximum, overriding safety limiters that would normally prevent such dangerous operation. The machine spirit resisted, valves straining against my commands, but I persisted, speaking the ritual phrases I had memorized from the inscriptions, asking the Omnissiah to bless this work and guide my hands. Slowly, reluctantly, the purifier accepted the override. The temperature gauge began to climb. The northern purifier required more preparation. I had to manually open several auxiliary valves to redirect flow from the western purifier's overflow into the northern intake pipes. The valves were stiff from disuse, requiring all my strength to turn. One of them broke as I forced it, the handle snapping off in my hand, but the valve itself opened enough to allow passage. I returned to the console and activated the ignition sequence, watching as the northern purifier rumbled to life. The sound was different from the western unit, deeper, with a grinding quality that suggested damaged components. But it lit, it burned. The temperature began to rise. The eastern purifier was the key to everything. It was the largest, the oldest, the most complex of the three. Its control console had twice as many switches as the others, and the prayer inscriptions covering its surface were so worn that I could barely read them. I stood before it for a long moment, my hand hovering over the activation switch. Once I pulled this lever, there would be no turning back. The sequence would complete, the district would burn. I would become responsible for a massacre that would dwarf any atrocity I could imagine. But I would also stop the infection. I would save the hive. I would do what needed to be done. I pulled the lever. The eastern purifier did not ignite immediately. Instead, I heard a series of mechanical clicks as ancient gears engaged, as systems that had slept for centuries began to wake. The machine spirit was testing itself, running through diagnostic routines, ensuring it was capable of the task I demanded. The clicking continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a roar that shook the entire chamber, the purifier lit. Flame erupted from vents along its surface. The temperature gauge spiked so rapidly that I thought it had broken. The heat was immediate and overwhelming, a wall of scorching air that drove me back from the console. All three purifiers were burning now, their combined output turning the chamber into a furnace. The pipes began to scream. It was a sound I had never heard before, metal expanding beyond its design tolerances, pressure building to catastrophic levels. The entire pipe network was connected to the purifiers, thousands of kilometers of ancient tubing that snaked through every corner of the sublevel. As the heat spread through them, as the biomass and waste and contamination within began to combust, the pipes became conduits of destruction. I heard the first ruptures seconds later, distant explosions that echoed through the tunnels, then more, then dozens. The purifiers were doing exactly what I had calculated they would do. They were burning everything. I climbed the access ladder as the chamber filled with smoke. The infected had reached the hatch when I emerged. 3 of them stood in the shaft, blocking my path upward. They did not attack. They simply stood there, their eyeless faces turned toward me, their tendril fingers reaching out as though to welcome me into their garden. Behind them, I could see the cathedral chamber burning, the columns of diseased flesh erupting into flame as superheated air rushed through the ventilation system. The bioluminescent glow was fading, replaced by the orange light of fire. I pushed past the infected, shoving them aside with strength born of desperation. They did not resist. They were burning too, their bodies smoking as the heat consumed them from within. The tunnels were collapsing. Sections of ceiling fell as the pipes above ruptured completely, spilling burning waste and superheated steam. The cysts that covered the walls ignited spontaneously, their surfaces crackling as moisture boiled away and the flesh beneath caught fire. The smell changed from sweet rot to acrid smoke, a choking haze that burned my lungs even through the cloth wrapped around my face. I ran through the eastern vents, following the route by memory because visibility had dropped to nearly zero. I could hear screaming now, the distant sounds of workers caught in the conflagration, their voices raised in terror and agony. I tried not to think about them. I tried not to imagine the flames spreading through habitation blocks, through corridors where families huddled together hoping for rescue that would never come. I emerged into a junction chamber and found myself face to face with Overseer Menth. She stood in the center of the space, her augmetic eye flickering in the firelight, her flesh eye wide with horror. She was covered in burns, her clothes smoking, but she was alive. She saw me, and her expression shifted from horror to rage. "What have you done?" she screamed over the roar of flames. "What have you done, Calobrint?" I tried to answer, tried to explain about the purifiers and the infection and the necessity of what I had chosen, but the words would not come. Instead, I simply stood there, meeting her gaze, letting her see the truth in my eyes. She understood. I saw the moment of comprehension, the terrible instant when she realized that I had condemned the district to save the Hive. Her augmetic hand came up as though to strike me, but she stopped herself. She lowered her hand. She nodded once, a gesture that might have been acceptance or might have been damnation, and turned away. She walked into the smoke, and I never saw her again. The main access stairwell was a chimney of flame. The heat rising from below had ignited everything combustible, turning the 17 flights into a vertical furnace. But the stairs themselves were metal, and metal did not burn. I wrapped my arms around my head and ran upward, taking the steps 3 at a time, feeling the skin on my hands blister and split as I gripped the handrails. The climb seemed endless, each flight identical to the last, each landing offering no relief from the heat. My lungs screamed for air that was not there. My vision narrowed to a tunnel. I focused on the steps before me and nothing else, climbing through sheer mechanical repetition because stopping meant death. I reached the upper level and found the emergency bulkhead sealed. Of course it was sealed. The Arbites had fallen back days ago, sealing every exit to contain the infection. I pounded on the metal with my burned hands, shouting for someone to open it, knowing no one would hear me over the sound of the inferno below. This was where I would die, I realized. Not in the purifier chamber, not in the tunnels. Here, meters from safety, stopped by a barrier I could not breach. The irony was almost beautiful. I had sacrificed 30,000 people and would die with them anyway, unable to reach the safety I had killed to preserve. Then the bulkhead opened. On the other side stood an Arbite's sergeant, his armor scorched, his face covered in soot. He looked at me with an expression I could not read, something between disgust and amazement. Behind him I could see other Arbites, their weapons raised, ready to shoot anything that came through the bulkhead. The sergeant grabbed my arm and hauled me through, then slammed the bulkhead shut behind me. He shoved me against the wall and demanded to know what had happened, how I had survived, what I had done. I told him about the purifiers. I told him about the sequence I had activated. I told him that the infection would burn completely, that nothing would survive the temperatures I had generated. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned to one of his subordinates and ordered him to relay the information to command. They kept me in a holding cell for 3 days while the fires burned below. The cell was small and dark, but it had air that did not smell of decay, and water that was clean, and silence broken only by the occasional footsteps of guards. I sat on the metal bench and stared at my hands. The burns were severe, the skin blackened and peeling, but a decay servitor had treated them with unguents that prevented infection and reduced pain to manageable levels. I could not feel my fingers properly anymore. I wondered if I would ever scrub floors again, if the nerve damage was permanent, if I would be reassigned to some other meaningless task or simply discarded as damaged goods. It did not seem to matter. Nothing seemed to matter except the memory of that moment when I pulled the lever, when I decided that 30,000 lives were worth less than 30 million. On the fourth day, they released me. An Administratum official arrived at my cell, a thin woman with data slate and servo skull attendant. She informed me that the purge had been successful. The infection had been completely eradicated. Analysis of atmospheric samples from the sublevel showed no trace of spores or contamination. The fires had burned so hot that the very metal of the pipes had melted in places, ensuring absolute sterilization. She paused, consulting her data slate, then continued. The official record would list the incident as a routine Mechanicus intervention to address a sanitation system failure. There would be no mention of plague, no mention of infection, no mention of the workers who had died, and certainly no mention of a floor scrubber who had activated forbidden machinery without authorization. I asked what would happen to me. She looked up from her data slate, her expression neutral. I was being reassigned to the mid-hive maintenance cadres, she said. A promotion of sorts, though one that came without any accompanying pay increase or benefits. The sub-level manufactorum districts would remain sealed for the foreseeable future while reconstruction efforts proceeded. My expertise with the lower systems made me valuable elsewhere. She handed me a data chit containing my new work assignment and dismissed me without further comment. The servo skull followed her out, its eye lenses recording everything, ensuring the official narrative remained unchallenged. I emerged from the Arbeits precinct into morning light. It was the first time I had seen the sun in 11 years. The hive's upper reaches were open to the sky, great gaping wounds in the structure that allowed pale dawn light to filter down through layers of smog and industrial haze. I stood on a transit platform high above the manufactorum districts, looking out over the vast cityscape that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere below, 30,000 people had died in fire. Somewhere below, the pipes still smoldered, radiating heat that would take weeks to dissipate. Somewhere below, my mother lived, safe and unaware of how close she had come to death. I had saved them all. I had murdered to do it, but I had saved them. The transit car arrived and I boarded, taking a seat near the window. The other passengers were mid-hive workers, clerks, and technicians and low-level administrators who had probably never set foot in the sub-levels. They did not look at me. They did not see the burns on my hands or the soot still staining my clothes. They saw only another worker, another cog in the infinite machine of the Imperium, unremarkable and forgettable. Which was exactly what I was, I supposed. Just a floor scrubber who had been in the right place at the right time, who had remembered a training tour from 11 years ago, who had possessed just enough knowledge to do something terrible and necessary. The transit car climbed higher, leaving the manufactorum districts behind. I thought about Overseer Menth, walking into the smoke. I thought about Julm, shambling through corridors with his body split open. I thought about the infected I had seen tending their garden in the cathedral chamber, cultivating decay with purpose and intelligence. I thought about the servitors in the purifier chamber, standing silent witness to my decision. I thought about the prayer inscriptions on the ancient machines, asking the Omnissiah to bless their work. I thought about the screaming I had heard as the flames spread. I would carry these memories for whatever remained of my life. The Emperor protects, they said. But the Emperor had not protected the sublevel. I had. A floor scrubber named Callow Brint, armed with nothing but a wire brush and a half-remembered maintenance tour, had stood between the hive and annihilation. I had made the choice that no one else could make, had pulled the lever that no one else even knew existed, and now I would live with that choice, knowing that the official records would never acknowledge it, knowing that the truth would die with me, knowing that in the eyes of the Imperium I had done nothing at all. The transit car reached my new district, and I disembarked. The air here was cleaner, the corridors wider, the lighting brighter. Mid-hive maintenance was considered respectable work, a step above the sub-levels but still firmly within the laboring classes. I would scrub different floors now, check different pipes, serve different overseers. My life would continue in its small, predictable patterns. I would collect my ration chits, I would attend the mandatory sermons, I would perform my duties with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined my previous 11 years, and no one would ever know what I had done. I reported to my new work assignment and received my equipment. The bucket was newer than my old one, the brush less worn, the glow rod was brighter, powered by a more efficient lumen cell. I accepted these tools and began my first shift in the mid-hive, walking corridors that had never known the sweet rot of Nurgle's touch, scrubbing floors that gleamed with polished plasteel. The work was exactly the same. The work was fundamentally different. I moved through it mechanically, my burned hands performing their functions despite the pain, my mind elsewhere. Weeks passed, then months. The burns healed, leaving scar tissue that made my fingers stiff but functional. I learned the patterns of my new district, the locations of the critical valves, the numbers of the pipe junctions. I recorded everything in a new logbook, identical to the one I had carried in the sublevels. Life settled into familiar rhythms. I saw my mother once, at a transit station, but I did not approach her. I simply watched her board a car heading toward the administrative districts, where she worked as a data clerk. She looked tired, but healthy. She had survived. That was enough. I dreamed of the purifiers almost every night. In my dreams, I stood before the control console again, my hand hovering over the activation switch. But in the dreams, I made different choices. Sometimes I pulled the lever and nothing happened, and the infection spread anyway, consuming the entire hive while I watched helplessly. Sometimes I refused to pull the lever, and the Arbites broke down the hatch and executed me for unauthorized access. Sometimes I pulled the lever, and the purifiers exploded, killing me instantly in a ball of fire. And sometimes, in the worst dreams, I pulled the lever and the fires did not stop, spreading upward through the hive until everything burned, until millions died screaming, until the entire structure collapsed into ash and ruin. I never told anyone about these dreams. I never spoke of the sublevels or the infection or what I had done. When other workers asked where I had transferred from, I said only that I had worked in sanitation for many years and left it at that. They did not press. No one cared about the personal histories of floor scrubbers. We were interchangeable parts, easily replaced, quickly forgotten, which suited me perfectly. Anonymity was a kind of protection, a shield against questions I could not answer and truths I could not share. The official narrative held. I occasionally saw news slate reports about the sub-level reconstruction efforts. The Mechanicus had declared the area structurally unsound and ordered a complete rebuild of the pipe networks. Thousands of work crews had been assigned to the project, dismantling the old systems and installing new ones blessed with proper rituals and machine spirit appeasements. The reports mentioned in passing that a sanitation failure had necessitated the emergency shutdown of the district, but provided no details about casualties or causes, just a routine intervention, exactly as the Administratum official had told me. The truth was buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and official silence, and would remain buried forever. I learned to live with what I had done, not to accept it, not to forgive myself. Simply to live with it, to carry the weight of 30,000 deaths and continue performing my duties. I scrubbed floors, I checked valves, I recorded observations in my logbook, and in the quiet moments between tasks, I thought about the nature of necessity, about the calculations we make when faced with impossible choices, about what it means to be responsible for both salvation and slaughter, about whether the Emperor truly protects or whether protection is something we must create for ourselves through terrible acts of will. I had been a floor scrubber. I had become a murderer. I remained a floor scrubber. The Imperium had no category for what I had done, no recognition for the choice I had made. In the eyes of the Administratum, I was simply a worker who had been reassigned due to district closures. The promotion to mid-hive maintenance was coincidental, unrelated to any specific action on my part. My service record showed 11 years in the sub-levels followed by ongoing service in the mid-hive, with no notation of anything unusual or exceptional. Perfect obscurity, perfect anonymity. Years would pass before I understood that this was its own kind of damnation. To carry the knowledge of what I had done without acknowledgement, without judgment, without any external validation that the choice had been necessary or right. To wake each morning knowing that thousands had burned because of my decision, and to have no one to tell, no confessor to absolve me, no authority to confirm that I had acted correctly. Just the certainty that the hive still stood, that the infection had been stopped, that the millions above continued their lives unaware of how close they had come to annihilation. I would carry this burden alone until my death, and when I died, the truth would die with me, buried in an unmarked grave or incinerated in a corpse disposal furnace, forgotten by the very hive I had saved. No monument would mark my sacrifice, no prayer would be said in my name, no record would note that Callow Brint, floor scrubber and mass murderer, had stood between the Imperium and the dark powers that sought to corrupt it. I would simply cease to exist, another anonymous worker who had served his time and returned to the void from which all servants of the Emperor eventually emerge. But the hive would stand. That was the truth I clung to in the darkest moments. The hive would stand, the millions would live, the infection would not spread. I had paid the price in blood and fire and nightmare memories, but the cost had been worth it. Had to have been worth it, because if it had not been worth it, if those 30,000 had died for nothing, then I was not a savior but simply a monster, and the screams I heard in my dreams were the just condemnation of the innocent I had murdered. I scrubbed floors in the mid-hive and tried not to think about whether I deserved condemnation or forgiveness. The answer, I suspected, was both. Or neither, or something else entirely that had no name in the languages of men. I had acted. I had chosen. I had burned away the corruption at a cost that would haunt me forever. Whether that made me a hero or a villain was a question I could not answer, a judgment I could not make about myself. So I simply continued. I worked. I breathed. I lived with the knowledge that somewhere in the official records of Hive Tertius, buried in layers of data and bureaucratic notation, was a single line that said routine mechanicus intervention and nothing more. The truth was mine alone to carry. I stood on a high platform one evening, months after my reassignment, looking out over the hive as the sun set behind layers of smog. The light turned everything red and gold, beautiful in a way that seemed wrong after what I had witnessed. Beauty still existed in this world. People still laughed and loved and hoped. Children still played in the cramped playgrounds of the mid-hive. Workers still gathered in communal halls to share meals and stories. Life continued, oblivious and precious and fragile. I had preserved this. I had burned 30,000 people to preserve this. And I would do it again, if necessary, because the alternative was unthinkable. The Emperor protects. But sometimes, in the darkest corners of the Imperium, the Emperor's protection comes from the hands of floor scrubbers who remember maintenance tours and possess just enough knowledge to do terrible, necessary things. I was one of those hands. I would remain one of those hands until death claimed me and the burden passed into silence. And if, in some distant future, the hive faced another threat, another impossible choice, I hoped that there would be someone like me. Someone anonymous and unremarkable and willing to make the calculation. Someone who would pull the lever and live with the consequences. Because that is what the Imperium requires. Not heroes, not saints. Just servants willing to do what must be done, regardless of the cost to their souls. I returned to my dormitory that evening and added a single line to my logbook. The infection is purged. The hive stands. Nothing more needed to be recorded. The truth was written in fire and ash, and the memories that would never fade. I closed the logbook and placed it on my shelf next to the other tools of my trade. Tomorrow I would return to work. I would scrub floors. I would check valves. I would be Callow Brint, anonymous maintenance worker, unremarkable and forgettable. And I would remember, always.